Jarrett, welcome to the show. How are you, bro?
I'm doing well, buddy. How about you?
I'm doing great. It's great to see your face again. It's been how many months? 3 or 4 months now since I was out there hanging out with you in Oregon.
A little bit longer than that. Actually, it's coming up on 6 months.
Is it
So
has been 6 months?
yeah, you
Because
were
I
there
came
at
out
the
in September, right? So yeah,
right.
October, November. Wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jared and I really excited to have Jared on the show. Jared and I go way back to Beaumont, Texas, and Centerville, Texas. I can't remember. Do you remember when we first met? Did you reach out to me, or where did we
Well,
first meet?
we had been Facebook friends for a long time before that, but we met when I reached out to you. It was during one of those unfortunate events a couple of years ago in our country over one of the killings, and I reached out to you and asked you if you would come and talk about racism in kind of a forum with me, and then preach a series of lessons for us. For so,
Yeah.
and you and I went and canvassed the neighborhoods, walking around. It was not. It was a Texas. I want to say September when we did that. So
Yeah.
I was pretty ripe by the time we got done. It was hot and sweaty.
Now, I do remember, one of the things I remember most about that, like as soon as I got there, I was thinking that we were going to take maybe an hour or two off, but you're like, no, all right, here are the flyers, and we're just going to get right after
Yeah.
it. So that was one of the big things that stood out to me was you were ready to rock and roll and get after it,
hmm
man.
Well, it was nothing like that had ever been done in Centerville before. It was a community that had a lot of division in it historically, and I knew that getting that started right off the bat was going to be important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things that I know about Jared, and before we dive into a little bit more about who you are and your new podcast, Man Up, I have to ask the question, Jared. How much coffee have you had this morning? Now, Jared is a huge coffee fan,
Yes.
and while I was there, he's an expert at he's an expert at making coffee. You need to write a book about coffee or
Well,
something
Mark
like
Roberts has
that
kind
because
of
he
done
has
that
this whole.
already.
No, 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 no. You know, there's a part for you to do here as well. So please tell us what kind of coffee do you like to
Uh,
drink, and how do you make it, and how many have you had? How many cups have you had
Well,
today?
Lauren and I only drink imported coffee from the great state of Texas. This is my biblically speaking mug. This is jet fuel. It's actually a Costa Rican blend from a company called Independence Coffee, and they're in Brenham, Texas. Favorite. It sounds like it would be really bitter, and the coffee was actually kind of a joke that the guy who started Independence Coffee had some friends that worked for Continental Airlines. I'm as big an evangelist for Independence Coffee as I am for the Bible. It feels like some days, but he had some friends that worked for the old Continental Airlines, and they were complaining about how there's not really much to do when you're flying a plane in the days of autopilot, and so. But they didn't want to drink a lot of coffee because it'd make them sick at their stomachs. So they created this blend called jet fuel that was easy to drink and highly caffeinated. But this is only my second cup of coffee today, and the first one was at a men's
Oh,
breakfast that I went to and was terrible. So this is the first good cup of coffee that I've had today.
very nice, very nice. Yeah, that was one of the cool things seeing Jared in the kitchen making the coffee each morning, and it's he's got it down. So it's good coffee, and it'll definitely get you going. Well, tell our audience, Jared. I know a lot about
Mm-hmm.
you, but tell our audience in maybe 3 to 5 minutes. You're in Oregon
Right.
right now. You mentioned being an evangelist. You love coffee. You're a family man. But tell us this journey. How did you get started into preaching full time, and this passion about what you're doing right now?
How I got started preaching full time, I'd always wanted to be a preacher, and I took a test in junior high. It was kind of like I think they call it the ASVAB test, or they used to, that told you what branch of the military you needed to go into. And it was kind of the pre version of that, if you will. And I knew when I took this test, it's going to say preacher, 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 and it said scientist. And
Mm,
so I was kind of heartsick about that. I talked to my dad about it. He's like, dude, it was just a test. I mean, look at the questions you answered. Do you want to? Which would you rather do? Learn a new subject or attend a bake sale? Organize a school
yeah.
dance or a garage sale. It's like that's not.
Well, let me stop you right there before you go any
Uh-huh.
further. You said you knew that it was going to say preacher, preacher,
Right.
preacher. Why did you know? Why were you thinking that it was going to say?
Because that's all I'd ever wanted to be. No, I mean that's all I ever wanted to be, and I really thought that was the direction my life was going to be on, and then that didn't happen, and I'm like, okay, well, what do I do now? And my dad was patient with me. That I got it in my head I was going to be a child psychologist, and went to a lot of school for that. And then I found out there, at least the early courses in it, I think there's a lot of merit to it once you get beyond the early courses, but the early childhood development courses, there's a lot of stuff I didn't agree with. So I went into sales, and then I hadn't been in sales very long when a congregation in Mahia, Texas, not far from where you're actually, about 100 miles from where you're preaching or so. But I went and preached for them every other Sunday. And then they hired a full-time evangelist who really needed the work, and I didn't. And so I was let go from that. And it was maybe 2 Sundays before a congregation on the far east side of Houston asked me if they were on the verge of folding up. And they're still going to this day, to their credit. But they were on the verge of folding up, and I went and preached for them, and I thought it was going to be a few weeks. It ended up being 13 years. And I was doing full-time evangelist work and working full-time. I knew that couldn't continue, that Lauren and I had to get serious about adopting, and that was going to be more strain than I could put on doing both of those. So I folded up the evangelist role for a couple of years and went and played backstop for Tony Mock at Decker Prairie when he was out of town. So I guess I really didn't fold it up, but I was teaching Bible classes every quarter, and you can't get it out of your blood when you love it. And then I moved to Centerville, Texas, and folded up the secular career as soon as I was able to, and was there for almost 8 years, and I've been up here for a year and a half. So that's
Nice.
the journey.
Yeah.
It was always kind of meant to be. I just took me a little time to figure out how to get there.
When did you know that you wanted to preach? You mentioned that this is just all I wanted to do. You have this fire, in your bones of preaching. When did you know? How old were you, and how did you get to that point?
Man, this is an embarrassing story. I was pre-kindergarten. I would come home.
Really?
Yeah, I would come home, and I would drag out all my stuffed animals when we got home from church. I would pull the bench away from the piano that my mom's parents had given her when she was a kid. I never incorporated the piano because instrumental music was not okay. So, but I needed a pulpit. And I would lead singing for my bears and giraffes and things like that. I think E.T. attended worship service more than once. And
that is pretty.
And then I would mimic the points that Dee made. But there was something about Dee Bollman that just resonated with me. I am an extreme introvert, but I love people. I'm one of those introverts that loves people. It's very strange when you find one. People are draining to me, but I love them and I want to be around them. And so please don't think I don't like you. but at the end of being around people, I need to recharge. I need to go to a place where I can be by myself for a little while and sort of recharge. And Lauren knows that. But Lauren also pushes me out of my comfort zone to extend those times that between the recharges where I'm around people and doing what needs to be done. And I love people. And preaching is about the people. And I knew that at a young age. I couldn't articulate it that way, but I was always waiting for the bear to come forward at the end of the sermon, but he was always waffling on the pew. But preaching's about the people, and I love people, and I always have loved people, even as an introvert. I love people, and I think that's one of the things that when somebody tells you that they're an introvert, that they sometimes, you just don't like people. That's not true. Introverts a lot of times love people, but being around them is emotionally exhausted because we're always worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing or being misinterpreted or misunderstood. Whereas extroverts are like, if I break something, we'll fix it. And having that, that's right. Lauren. If I say something and it breaks, then I'll fix it. And she has honestly been so good for me. That she is the perfect helpmeet for me, and in way more ways than I knew when I married her.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome story. And there's a young boy at the congregation where I was at in Southeast Texas, and his mom sometimes will post photos even today. I don't know how old he is right now, but he has a little podium, and he does a sermon, and they record it. And I don't know if he has like his teddy bears and things like that out, but I think that's really good. So if I'm hearing you correctly, then Jared, Dee Bollman, and for those who don't know, Dee Bollman was a gospel preacher for a number of decades, had such a tremendous influence and impact in the hearts of so many people. So Dee really, really planted this seed, so to speak, or got you interested in getting into preaching.
Absolutely. Right? And just wanting to to love the most important part of people, even at a young age before I could articulate it. And I would go home and try to speak with the kind of passion and the kind of love, again, to my stuffed animals that he brought to the people. I called it churching, but but that's how it started. I mean, it's a cute story, but it was very formative for me. That it
Yeah.
really built me into the man that I am today.
Yeah. And that says something too about, I think, the impact as we talk a little bit more on the show today about family. I know you're a big family
Yeah.
man, so am I. We're trying to be the best men that we can be. But what you're saying is, I think, really important as you think about the influence of being consistent in our worship
Yeah.
services, right? So your parents definitely had an impact in, attending worship services. Some of the averages out there, and it may be more so with denominations, but we see it today in a number of churches as well. A lot of people are not attending worship services on a regular
Mm-hmm.
basis. And this kind of story, I think, really drives home that impact of the need for fathers to be in the picture
Yeah.
and for young children to understand, no, this is where we're going to be each first day of the week, because obviously we want to do it to worship God. There's an expectation there, but just seeing long term this benefit that came from you in your
Mm-hmm.
life at such a young age, I think is a powerful point to be said.
Yeah, there was a study recently done by the Barnum. I say recently; it's been the last 5 years by the Barnum Group, and I think it was the Barnum Group that did it. That they were talking about the biggest influences on how children continue in the faith, and the number one is how involved is dad in their life, particularly their spiritual development. And if dad was involved, if both parents were involved, then it was something like 80% to 90% were going to continue in that path. That if dad was involved and mom wasn't, then it was 75%. But if dad was not involved and mom was, then it fell below 50%. And if neither parent was really inclined to be at the worship services or involved in any kind of spiritual teaching, it fell below 25% very quickly.
Mm.
And that's eye-opening to me. And one of the things that really set this course for me was my dad. My dad, when I was young, was a shift worker. And that meant that there were some worship services that he could not be at because he was scheduled to be at the plant. But one thing I never saw my dad do was picking up extra shifts that would have conflicted with being at worship services, or going home and sleeping, even though he was dead tired from working the night before, if going home and sleeping meant he wouldn't be at the worship services with his family. Now, we may sprint home right after church was over so he could go to sleep and get 4 or 5 hours of sleep before he had to get back up and do it again. But I saw that in my dad. And there were a lot of other dads who were the fathers of people in the world, in some cases the fathers of people that we worshiped with, who would pick up those extra shifts, and it was allegedly to do it for their family. But what you see in a lot of cases is that the children didn't stay faithful because what dad was showing them was the picking up of the extra shift at the plant was more important than making sure that it's not just about getting him to worship service, it's seeing the influence that's important and showing their kids
Yep.
that.
Can you share with us any other things that your dad did? Obviously, attending worship services, so he's practicing what he
Mm-hmm.
preached. The idea, and I think that's a very important point of he managed his time with
Right.
work. And that's one of the biggest challenges of he didn't take a lot of those extra hours that he could
Mm-hmm.
have. How else was he able to influence you? You're an excellent student of the Bible. Did that come from dad? Did that come from
It came
mom?
from
What other things did he do to
It came
influence
from
you?
both of them. My dad probably more so than my mom, not because she's not an excellent student, but because I developed most of the way that I look at things academically. I developed because I wanted to be like my dad. That I was
Gotcha.
always wanting to form a deep relationship with him, and honestly, and this makes me sound really bad, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I didn't realize how deep the relationship with my dad was until he showed me that all of my brothers.
What do you
I
mean?
talked about this on Kenny Embree's podcast, Balancing the Christian Life. Great podcast, but you've been on there. That's a great podcast, by the way. I just, but all of my brothers, and I have 3, are like my dad in one really amazing way. They all have a lot of dexterity in their hands and can do anything manual or physical that you put in front of them. Jason is over 50 and he can reach blindly up into an engine and turn a bolt because he knows where it's at mentally and knows how to get his fingers there. I mean, there's all kind of sharp stuff around, cast metal and things like that that'll cut you. Aluminum, a lot of the blocks are made out of now. But Jason can do that and turn a bolt and not think twice about it and not ever lose his finger grip to, like, I can't tell if I'm turning right or left unless I'm looking at my hand because I'm not coordinated. Justin, my younger brother, is probably the preeminent guitarist that I have ever known who has not been signed to a record label. And in my opinion, he's better than a lot of guys that have been signed to record labels. I mean, he can pick up a riff and create 15 new riffs out of some riff that he's heard once. And
Wow.
and he's written music. He and I used to write songs together when we were teenagers, and I taught Justin to play guitar, but he surpassed me in about 3 weeks. And, I taught him how to play chords, and Justin's like, "Hey, have you ever heard of this chord?" I'm like, "Yeah, but I can't do it." And he's like, "Oh, here's how you do it." And it was 3 weeks after he picked up a guitar. I'm like, "You dork." But but he owns a home theater company, and he's doing
Wow.
gangbuster business in this home theater company in the Woodlands, Texas, and he's got people all over the country, calling him to come out and build these $1 million man cave kind of things. And he goes and does it because he's got that dexterity. My youngest brother, Jordan, is just like them. I didn't have anything like that with my dad. I'm the klutz of the family.
Mm.
If you ask me to play basketball, I'm going to do a face plant because my right foot doesn't know what my left foot's doing. And I was always jealous of that because a lot of our time as kids was spent helping dad work on cars because dad would sometimes help other people with their cars. He would keep our own cars up, and my job was the tool hander. You did not let Jared turn a wrench. Jared would drop a bolt or the wrench or the bolt and the wrench and a screwdriver you didn't even know he had into the engine if you let him turn a bolt. So I was the guy who they had to describe a tool to, and I would go in the garage and find it. And
Mm.
I would find 4 examples of what they were talking about, and it would be the 5th one before I got it right.
Right. That sounds like me too.
But my dad finally realized that even though he knew we had a connection, I didn't. And so for that, I didn't know we had a deep connection because my dad and I connect on a cerebral level. That's not saying my other brothers don't. My other brothers are incredibly intelligent, but my dad and I connected and bonded on that level. I didn't see the bond. And so when I got out of high school and for graduation, my dad says, "What do you want? Do you want a new car? Do you want to go somewhere? What do you want?" And being the geek and the dork that I was, I wanted a computer. And computers were not cheap then. But my dad went out and bought me a computer, but he did more than that. He had bought the family a computer a couple of years before. But he went out and bought his own computer, and together we upgraded those computers, learning what every part does, installing the operating system, and we had some very important conversations over the cerebral thing of building this computer. Then I began to realize, think about how many times you and dad have talked about the Bible, or think about how many times you and dad have talked about this book. And there's been several other bonding points, like we read the Harry Potter novels together. And we would go get them at midnight when they were released, and we would blow through them as fast as we could so we could talk about them at the end. And yeah, that's how I bond with my dad. And so that's where a lot of my biblical training came from. My mom is an excellent Bible student. She and he have brought several people to the Lord. But I think my way of looking at a text and analyzing a text really comes from my dad.
No, that's fantastic. And I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing a lot of things with that. Something that stands out to me, Jared, with what you were saying is the idea of talking and how, we often talk about we need to spend, time together, but, the quantity is important, but also the quality is important as well. And there's a lot of different ways that can happen. So I love hearing the idea or the fact that you can still have this bonding time, putting a car together or an engine or a computer or Harry Potter books. There's a lot of different things. One of the things that Joshua and I like to do, he's really into football. He wants to be a NFL football player. So he's got some footballs. And so we've been throwing the Nerf ball. My dad wasn't around growing up for the most part. But it was something my mom and I used to do a lot. We just have a tennis ball and, we just play
Yeah.
catch, in the house. But that was an opportunity to really talk and to share different feelings or struggles or
Mm-hmm.
challenges. And that's what a lot of young people, that's really, I think, what every young person wants. They need to know that their father sees
Mm-hmm.
them, that their father cares about them, that their father loves them. And those conversations and that training. And it's interesting where it doesn't have to always be like this rigid
Right.
schedule, but it's just kind of like a natural process, of the Harry Potter
Mm-hmm.
books. Well, you can connect in a lot of different ways, but it's still being available to
Yeah,
connect
Will
with.
and I bond over a lot of things, but one of the primary ones right now is the Lego games on the Switch. That he
Mm.
wants to go get every accomplishment in every Lego game, and so I'll take a couple hours a day to sit down with him, and that's quality time for he and I because we're having conversations the whole time. Which is the best
Yeah.
dinosaur? And Lego Jurassic World is the one he's doing right now. That if we go get this mini
Mm.
kit, Dad, we get the T-Rex skeleton, and then it'll be a skeleton running around Jurassic Park. I'm like, that's awesome. Let's go do it. And but it gives me time to talk about.
By the way, did you see the new preview for Jurassic
No, I
World
haven't.
or
I
Kingdom of
haven't yet.
World?
I've been uh, thinking, or not thinking about it. I've been intending to watch it, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. I need
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, it's pretty epic. Well, let's talk a little bit about your
Sure,
podcast, Man Up.
absolutely.
You and I don't know if we talked about this when I was there, but it may have been afterwards. But tell us a little bit about this podcast. How did it come to be? What is your main objective? What are you trying to accomplish with this podcast?
Oh, those are really great questions. It came to be from a couple different sources. A it started as a Facebook live series called Biblically Speaking a couple of years ago, and that was a terrible idea. I should have started it on YouTube because I lost over half my audience when I moved to YouTube. But Facebook was so frustrating and with getting things delivered on time that it was just not conducive to working. I mean, you remember some of the struggles. So about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I moved it to YouTube and started Biblically Speaking. Well, I really wanted to start doing a podcast because people can't watch YouTube and drive. And so YouTube is connecting with people after work or before work while they're having coffee or on the weekends, but it's not drive time. And for me, drive time was always kind of a weakness. I mean, you know my story with politics that I quit politics cold turkey, talk radio, everything about 10 years ago because it was making me, I would preach about loving my neighbor and hate the guy in front of me because he had the wrong bumper stickers on his car. So that was a big deal for me. And I could see it, I could see the same influences eating into the lives of my brethren. And I wanted to do something that would be drive time or maybe drive time and a little longer that would be spiritually uplifting to them. So I started a podcast called A Journey into the Word. And I just knew it was going to take off. And I did 4 episodes, and it was really just white noise. And the fourth episode I did was a two-parter that I never released the second part of because the audio on it was so bad. The guest was a friend of mine named David Osteen, and he was calling in from Centerville, and the audio was going up and down. And I just thought, this is a sign. This podcast is never going anywhere. It's not focused. So I started praying about it. I started thinking about it, and I thought, what needs to happen? And this was just after you left for your meeting down here when I was thinking about folding that up. In fact, you were on the first or the second of the Journey into the Word podcast. But I thought, who can I help that I am in a place to help? Because it's not about my ego and getting it out there. And while it would be it would be nice if there was some financial incentive tied to it. It's not about financial incentive right now. It's who can I help that needs to be helped. And I thought, men, because I looked at the podcast space and there's not a lot of podcasts out there that are biblically based, that the information is good, that are geared toward making men or helping men reach their spiritual potential. And I'd already gotten really comfortable talking to people with Biblically Speaking. And Biblically Speaking had already become more than a sermon a week. It was no longer a sermon. It was taking hard biblical passages and making them simple. And right now we're doing evidences in Biblically Speaking. So we're talking about DNA and dinosaurs, and it's kind of 2 weeks between episodes right now because I have to learn all the science behind it and then the Bible passages too. But Man Up, I was already so comfortable talking to people because of that I just jumped in with both feet. I thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the guy that steps in and talks to men. And it's not going to be, Men good, women bad, emotions bad. It's going to be talking to men like they're my friends. We are brothers in arms. We are comrades. We fight shoulder to shoulder and side by side, mile after mile, yard after yard, hand over hand, because each of us is going to help the other attain that crown that Jesus is going to give us. And I say that at the beginning of every podcast, but dude, I believe it. That it is written in my DNA to help people reach their spiritual potential. And right now, men are lost because we have lost the ability to communicate with one another. And Kenny Embry was talking about this on the podcast that I was on with him. His podcast, not the one that hasn't dropped that I did on mine.
Tell us the name of his
Balancing the
podcast.
Christian Life. It's a great podcast. It's just, I mean, he talks with people, and people will open up to Kenny. In fact, I mentioned this to him when he was on mine, that the topics are kind of the backdrop for the guest and not the other way around. That people learn more from the guest that he has on his show than the topic that they're talking about, because that's where the helpful tips come in. You mentioned that in the pre-show we were doing, that you really want to get some helpful tips out. One of the helpful tips is you have to know that men bond around doing things. But if we're just doing things, then we might create friendships. But if we're going to help each other, we have to develop the conversation and the language associated with things like love and joy and grief. And until we develop those things, we're not going to have the important conversations. But we're also not going to have them until we're doing things together. So I really want Man Up, when somebody comes and they listen to the program, I want them to feel like we're doing something together. We're helping each other. And that's the reason why I wrap it in kind of the military shtick, that I kind of cut down on some of that because it was a little distracting, yeah. I think, from time to time. So I kind of dialed some of that back. And like the episode I did with Matt Basford that dropped yesterday, I didn't put any of that in other than the intro and the outro, because Matt was so vulnerable in that discussion. Even though it wasn't about his struggle, we were talking about him writing and becoming the servants of the people that are around us. He talked about his struggles with ALS, and it felt like it was going to be a detraction from the beauty of the conversation that we had. And I really think it's the best episode that I've done. And it's not me, it's Matt. And it was just so wonderful. But the reason for doing it the way that I do it is there's really three metaphors that you see in the Bible over and over again to talk about the Christian life. There's the agrarian too. There's the sowing and reaping, and the sheep and shepherd, right? And then you've got the metaphor of the soldier. What's interesting is we want to apply the soldier to how we engage with people in the denominational world. You know, we are soldiers for Christ, but you look at how that metaphor for soldier is used. It's not about going out there and slaying denominations. It's about slaying what's inside me that the devil's trying to get to grow, and winning that spiritual battle. And that's where the focus of Man Up is, that I can be a better father, I can be a better husband, I can be a better leader, I can be a better follower of Jesus, but I've got to kill something within me to reach that next potential, that next level of potential that's out there.
What are some things that you feel like that maybe at the top of the list with men that need to be slayed or killed in our hearts? What are some of those things that you've seen or have talked about, or things that that need to be addressed?
I would say at the top of the list is probably pride. Pride doesn't take the form that we think it does. We often think of pride as ego or even arrogance. But pride is really the mask that we put on top of vulnerability so that people don't see what's underneath. They don't see the fear. They don't see the worry. They don't see the stress. Because, you know, I'm a Western man. I can do whatever I need to do. I built myself. No, you didn't. We all are who we are if we are Christians by the grace of God. And if you don't have that vulnerability, and it's not just about let me show you my wounds so you can help. Sometimes it's let me show you my wounds so I can help you. And if you don't have that vulnerability, then you don't have connection. And that's what Paul is talking about in Galatians 6, when he says that if any of you is overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. And what Paul does there is he says, Jesus says, you look at your brother, and I'm paraphrasing, and you see his burden, And when he's stumbling underneath his burden, it becomes your burden. And each of you is supposed to bear your own load, which may be at times your brother's load, because he doesn't have the wherewithal to do it. But you're not going to get there by saying, and Chris Emerson made this point on my podcast a few weeks ago. He says, when elders talk with people, one of the things that can be really hurtful is when you say, you know what, you need to do better. If you're looking at a guy and he's struggling and he feels his kids drifting away and his marriage is on the rocks and all of those things, and you just tell him, you need to do better, he's going to say, yeah, I know. I just don't know how. Saying you need to do better is easy. But getting your hands in the dirt and helping is love. And until you get to that level of vulnerability, you're not helping anybody, including yourself, achieve the calling of Jesus.
So how do we help young men? Both you and I have boys, and we want them to become disciples of Jesus Christ. How do we help them with this, with the vulnerability, with the understanding that they need other people? For me, growing up, my dad wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So I was surrounded by women, which was fine. My mom, my grandmother, my sister. I think, this mindset that I had of I'll figure it out myself or I'll do it myself has been good. But at times that can also be challenging too. So how do we help our children, our young men to develop this kind of attitude or disposition that you're talking about?
Well, there's a balance. I mean, we definitely want our kids to be self-sufficient. We want them to be able to look at a situation and say, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing, and I'm going to do the right thing. But we also don't want to teach self-sufficiency at the expense of love. And you can lean on me. And part of that is the maturity of being a parent. You have to stop and think about, okay, what lesson do I want, I'm putting myself in your shoes. What lesson do I want Josh to walk away from at this point? Is it, hey, you needed to do this yourself? Or, hey, somebody that loves the way that they love is going to show you, yeah, you should have done better, but here's how we're going to clean it up and fix it. And sometimes it is the former lesson. Maybe when there's been a repeat offense, okay, you know what you need to do to take care of this. And if it gets too far over your head, then I'll come help you because I got your back. But more often than we would think, it probably needs to be the former. And that goes for being a preacher. I mean, when you got a guy that comes up to you, and I use this example a lot because it's becoming more and more prevalent, and says, I'm struggling with pornography. The reaction of most people in the congregation is going to be, well, yeah, he's struggling with pornography, but I would bet 20 to 30% of the people, men and women in the congregation, probably are as well. They just don't put it out there. I've seen situations where, unfortunately, and this one makes me so sad, but young ladies who thought they were in love, they sent pictures, inappropriate pictures, to a young boy, and they've gotten out. And I've seen that happen more times than I care to remember or heard about it happening. I haven't seen the pictures, but I want to be clear about that. But I've seen the story unfold. And from that point on, it's almost like she's walking around with a scarlet letter. And Kenny Embry said something when he was on my podcast the other day, and that episode's not going to drop till next week. But he said, one of the things that I teach my kids is how to find out who's in your corner. The person who comes with blame and doesn't offer help, they're not in your corner. The person who comes to you and says, look, I know this isn't good. I'm not going to tell you it is good, but how can I help? Or not how can I help, but this is what I want to do to help. How can I help shifts the burden to the other person. You got to figure out what you need and then tell me. But this is what I'm willing to do to help you. Will it help? That person's in your corner. And our young people are not little adults. But they're not blank slates either. I think that's kind of the myth that your child is a blank slate. They're not. That there are things that are written by nature and there are things that are written by nurture before you even know you're writing things on their heart. And I remember when Will was little, I would be working in the kitchen and with, doing something related to housework that, because Lauren might have been off at a ladies' function because she was in Centerville. She was always all over the place helping people. So a lot of times she always felt like the house was kind of her responsibility, and I would be the backstop for her. I would go do, the other things around the house that weren't right under her feet. But some days I would take on something that she really felt like was her burden because she was doing kingdom work. I mean, she was going out and helping a brother or a sister in Christ. And I remember there were times when I would be working on something in the kitchen, maybe putting up the dishes or something, and Will would come tug on my pants leg. And he would look at me with these he couldn't communicate yet, but it would be, yeah, but okay? I'm like, no, okay, because I don't understand what yabba means. It's usually, hey, I want to watch this episode of Thomas, or the batteries fell out of Lightning McQueen. But he would come to me to resolve the problem, and because we spoke to him, he would try to, he wouldn't squall or cry about it. He would come to us and speak to us about the problem. And it was frustrating because he couldn't speak. but he would quickly learn from that you can talk through a problem with dad, or you can talk through a problem with mom, because it wasn't just me that he did it to. And you're writing things on your children's heart before you know it. So when you grumble and when you complain, or when you're frustrated, and that's my big one, is I have this negative dialogue. It's part of why I do Man Up. I have negative dialogue in my head all the time. I'm always, that's probably the number one avenue the devil tries to work on me with, is discouragement. And I realized the other day, hearing one of his conversations, how much of my negative dialogue escapes my ears, and I've started venting it to the outside world. And I said, and this is to me, not him. I'm like, whoa, buddy, you got to stop that. Because he's already started the process of writing that on his heart. And I think that goes back to the example of my dad. That my dad, and I don't know whether he knew it mentally or just intuitively, if it was a cognitive thought or just an intuition, but he could see that I was struggling to define the relationship that I had with him, even though I knew he loved me and he knew I loved him. And he made the way to define that relationship. So you know what? I don't find Lego video games on the Nintendo Switch very engaging. I don't find them a lot of fun. I'm not going to play them by myself. But I will meet him on that level because that's where he's at. And I would say to the parents, I mean, this is, pro tip is, I guess I can't be a pro yet because I've only got one kid and he's 8. But dad tip from me to you, don't push the video games into the room because they annoy you when they're on the television. Pick up the controller, find out what they're consuming, set some limits on what they're consuming, but enjoy the journey with them, because that's where the life-building moments for your kid may be happening, and you're not part of it.
Yeah. Well, you've said so many great things, Jared, and I was going to talk to you too about electronics, and you kind of touched on that. And I appreciate your vulnerability, talking a little bit about your discouragement as well. I liked what you said too about how the things that are in our minds, if not careful, can begin to seep out, right, into our language, into our life, and our children. They may not even say it, but they naturally pick it up. And so this idea of what we're imprinting, or how they're picking up on cues and things like that. Let's talk about that a little bit more with discouragement. And you don't necessarily have to talk about your discouragement, but there are men who can find themselves discouraged. The pandemic is still going on. You've had people on your podcast who have, diseases that are eventually going to take their lives. There's a lot of reasons sometimes where men can be discouraged. Maybe they're working too much. Maybe they know that they are not as connected to their family, but they're still trying to navigate, okay, how do I do that? Or maybe they're seeing, okay, well, maybe I'm running out of time. There's also that danger as well, where eventually we run out of this time where our kids are in our homes to make sure that we develop that. So what would you say to the men out there who are listening, who may find themselves discouraged? And what would you want their wives to know as well, that when they do see their husbands in these periods or moments of discouragement, how to navigate that too?
I would tell the wonderful host of this podcast to have Chris Emerson on, because he has some great takes on that. But baby steps. I mean, you're right. Our kids are only with us for a few years. I mean, I blinked and Will's 8 years old. I don't know where that time went. I know we went to Disneyland a couple of times in that time. I know I changed a lot of diapers. I know that he's really timid and doesn't want to learn to ride a bicycle but needs to. But I also know he's really brave about other things, that he will jump on a motorized scooter that goes, 15 miles an hour. And he goes, "Oh, Dad, do I need to be wearing my helmet?" Yes, yes, you do. Um, but discouragement happens when we look at a situation that we've allowed to get out of control and we don't see that our God is really big enough to handle it. That the prodigal son was as far from his father as he ever could be. I'm assuming, Jewish boy, since Jesus is teaching the parable, and he's fighting with pigs over what they're eating. But he knew one thing, that even if he had to come back as his father's lowest servant, his father would take him home. And even if it meant waiting tables in his dad's house for the rest of his life, but that's not how his father received him. And I mean, the point of the parable is really the contrast. It's not about the son at all. It's the contrast between the father and the older brother. Because the older brother gives out justice. The father gives out mercy. And there is always mercy to those who turn to God. So my first, probably somewhat hypocritical answer, because in the middle of discouragement, it's awfully hard to remember to pray. But my first answer on discouragement is pray. And if somebody comes up to me and says, "I'm discouraged about this," or "I'm struggling with this," or, God forbid, something's happened in somebody's life like adultery. The big things, not the tiny little things like, oh, a bill slip passed and now my credit score went down or something like that. Not the tiny things, but the big things are often where we just completely leave God out of the situation. And I'll ask people, and Chris gave me a third one to ask the other day, but I'll ask them, "How's your prayer life? And what have you been reading?" And Chris gave me one the other day that I think really needs to enter into the conversation, and that is, tell me what you believe about Jesus. Is he your Savior or is he not? And honestly, we get discouraged because the problem seems big. And I don't know how far away the prodigal son was from his father, but I do know that the way home began with a step. The way to being a better father. Yeah, you're a father and your kids are in their teenage years. You absolutely, I totally agree with you. You blew the formative years. It's going to be hard, but that conversation leaves you with nothing. The conversation that will help you is, I tell you what, why don't you and me and your boy go do something that he really enjoys? Whether it's batting cages, I'm terrible. You can laugh at the preacher in the batting cage. That sitting down playing video games, great. Let's get a LAN party together at my house, or let's play some tabletop games. Let's build something. But you know what? You're not going to turn him into an ardent believer of Jesus tomorrow. But if he sees his dad turning, the boy's going to want to know why. Or the daughter's going to want to know why. And the answer to discouragement is not, it's a journey of 1,000 miles. The answer to discouragement is, I can take the next step that's in the right direction.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. Take the step. You can take the next step in the right direction. And again, you're touching on what our children see in us. Right. So helping our children to see, there will be these highs and lows. I love what you said about the prodigal son, the story in Luke chapter 15, the idea of mercy and justice. And I think that's something very important for men to hear that. There's a lot of pressure on men, but for all of us to hear that too. I have a theory, and I was thinking about something. We've mentioned a lot of names on here. Matt Bassford, he's a brother in Christ. He has ALS. He's publicly made this known, so I'm not revealing anything that's secret. He had a post about strength and about, really relying on our own strength. And I was thinking about this, and I was talking to a brother in Christ yesterday, and I said, I have a theory about this because I'm into fitness. I love to work out and health and things like that. There have been plenty of times where I've fasted for health benefits, but I really started thinking a little bit more about fasting. And one thought that I had was, is there anything in the Sermon on the Mount that's optional?
No.
And so my second thought was, for the most part, that section in Matthew 6, when you fast, that's something I okay, yeah, you don't have to do it. And, if you want to do it, you can. But after reading Matt's article, one thought that I had, and I'd love to get your perspective. I could be totally wrong and say, dude, you're totally wrong about it. But one thought that I had was, I think fasting is something that's built in by God that certainly helps us to rely even more upon Him and His strength. Now, you get all the benefits from the physical
Mm-hmm.
side, but it really starts off with Him, where there is this abstaining, there is this self control that's being built, there is this reliance upon Him and not on us. And I'm wondering a lot more, if that's something we've overlooked. Yes, the prayer is important. That's what Jesus said. When you pray, the reading is important. Mary has chosen the good part or the good portion, sitting at the feet of
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. But I'm curious your thoughts on the fasting aspect, with respect in particular to men, but also to men and women, as another way to understand this reliance and trust and strength of
Sure.
God and not on ourselves.
I haven't thought much about fasting as what it did. I know it's good. There was only that I can remember one specific fast that was recorded, as God ordained. God ordered it in the Old Testament.
Yes.
Um, and off the top of my head, I can't think of where that's at. But there were a lot of people who fasted.
I think it's, yeah.
That, if I remember right, Nineveh fasted when they heard the words of Jonah. That Jesus fasted when he went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. That wasn't something that was commanded of him. But the lesson that he taught to us in just when he is alone in the wilderness with just him and Satan is that ultimately his strength was not going to get him through that moment. There are lots of times where our strength is going to fail us. An elder down here or up here is burying his mom next week. She died of COVID at a time when not a lot of people are still dying of COVID. I mean, we've kind of reached the bottom end of the bell curve, hopefully. She was one of the outliers. And it's sobering to think that there's nothing that all of medical science could do for her in a disease that most people are surviving. And it humbles you in a way that maybe we ought to be humbled sometimes. I'm not going to say that the Bible commands Christians to fast, because it doesn't. But I think the evidence is there that shows that abstaining, and it's not just from food. Paul talks about abstaining from the sexual relationship in marriage by mutual agreement to draw closer to God in 1 Corinthians 7. There's lots of things that we can abstain from. And honestly, technology, I think, is one of them. If you want to talk about what really messes with the communication channels between you and God, it's having your Bible on your phone. And I'm not one of those Luddites that's like, oh, Bibles on the phone aren't real Bibles. They are real Bibles. But it takes a lot of discipline to stay in God's Word when your Bible is on the phone.
Yep.
And Facebook and text messages are dropping, and Wordle scores are popping. I don't even play Wordle. I'm a word guy and I don't play Wordle.
I don't know. I haven't played it either.
I thought about banning people that do for 30 days just to see if it calms down. I'm not against Wordle, but it's just like
who play
all of a sudden it was like Pokemon Go. All of a sudden it's all over the place. I'm like, what's going on? But I don't know what this is and I don't want to. But those things are dropping in front of you. Maybe what if for 30 days your fast looked like this? During your time with God, you were going to go get out an old paper Bible. You were going to put your phone in a box where you couldn't see the screen or turn it off, because you know what? All those things will be there in an hour. And what if you did that for 30 days? That's a kind of fast. What if for 30 days your phone was only used to send text messages between you and your wife, you and people in the congregation, and to receive phone calls? It wasn't there to sit at Chili's or Applebee's because the server's taken too long and veg out while scrolling through Facebook and now Facebook Reels or TikTok or whatever. What if you and your wife made that commitment, and we're going to work on, for the next 30 days, we're going to work on our relationship with each other. And maybe your relationship isn't bad, but maybe you want to reconnect over some things. Maybe you want to find that fire again, but you want it to be holy. You want it to be about putting God back in the center of a growing relationship between you and your wife. I got to tell you, one of the biggest barriers to communication with other people in the room is what you have in your hand that draws your eyes. So maybe,
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
fasting with food is also a good idea. There have been times when, well, I'll share this one. I've never shared it before, but I think it's beyond, blowing my own horn at this point because it's so far removed. But about the time that Centerville started, uh, the church I was working with there started sending money down to congregations that had been hit by the hurricane in Southeast Texas, which is really where you and I kind of cemented our friendship. We did a lot of goofy things together. that
That's right.
but when that happened, Lauren and I, we also had some sick brethren in the congregation that were very sick. One of them almost died because he had an abscess that he didn't know he even had in his pancreas that was actually killing him, and he just kept blaming it on indigestion and thought it was food poisoning when it finally got bad. And his doctor said, "No, I got to put you in the hospital. You're dying."
Wow.
We fasted several weeks, not all week, but we would take 2 days a week and we would fast. And those days were days that were devoted to prayer. And that fast would start at the time that dinner ended the day before and would go till it was time for dinner that night. So it would be a full 24-hour fast. And I got to tell you, I found more to talk to God about in those moments
Hmm.
than I did when I felt like prayer was sufficient, because I'll just work it into the next prayer that I have at dinner or before I go to bed.
Right. Right. Wow. Yeah. No. It's something I've been pondering, and
It's a good thing to ponder.
I think it's yeah, and I think it's important. Just a couple of more questions, if that's okay with
Go
you.
for it. My time's yours.
You talked about communication, and I want to talk about husbands and
Mm-hmm.
wives. Valentine's Day is coming
Mm-hmm.
up. It's always a big deal, and I really liked what you said about working on
Mm-hmm.
relationships. So this is a two-part question, and we can start with the men, or I guess with the women. But Jarrett, what would you say that men need to hear from their wives? And then the second question is going to be, what would you say that women need to hear from their husbands? So I'm actually going to be talking about this in a sermon tomorrow, Sunday, depending on when this podcast is
Okay.
released. That sermon will already have been preached. But I'm curious from you, what do you think men need to hear from their wives? Let's start
Okay.
there.
I've got serious answers and I've got a tongue in cheek answer for both that I want to start with. And
Let's start with the tongue in cheek, and then let's go to the
okay, because
serious.
the tongue in cheek answers I've really been using a lot with Kenny, because he and I have developed a fast friendship over these kinds of things. But the wife needs, you remember the YouTube video, It's Not About the Nail, where the woman's sitting there on the couch and she got the nail sticking out of her head? The wife needs to tell her husband what the nail is. The husband needs to tell his wife that I want to know what's behind the nail and how it got there.
Ooh,
That's what living with your
nice.
wife in an understanding way is all about.
Yeah.
That for us, I see a problem, I got a hammer, you got a nail, let's get this thing worked out. But to my wife, in fact, Mark Broyles, who I'm going to have hopefully have on the podcast, I reached out to him, but he's been a little busy lately. Mark, if you're listening, I still want you on Man Up to talk about relationships and sex and men and women.
There you go, Mark.
But yeah, I do that. I'm shaming him. No, no. Mark knows I
Yeah.
love him, but I got this from Mark Broyles, that men are like waffles and women are like spaghetti. We have our
Mm.
compartments. We've got a compartment for bills. We've got a compartment for work. We've got a compartment for kids. We got a compartment for wife. We got a compartment for life with wife. We've got a compartment for sex with wife. Women are like spaghetti. You ever tried to sort out a plate of spaghetti and just eat one noodle at a time? You're going to be at that plate for a long time, because every noodle is connected to every other noodle in some kind of way. And women are like
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
your wife is not going to compartmentalize the same way you do. I say that generically speaking. I mean, some women
Yeah.
are better at compartmentalizing than guys are. But your husband probably doesn't understand how things are interconnected. And
So what you're saying is men need to hear directly from their wives, this is what I need from
yes,
you.
this is what you need to do better. This is, or this
Yes.
is where I'm hurting, Or sometimes Lauren is
Yes.
really good at coming up and saying, hey, this is where I feel like I've fallen short in our relationship to you. I don't expect that ever. But she'll say, here's where I think I need to do better as a husband, a wife, as a wife, and a mother and a spouse. And
Okay. So that's
yeah,
yeah, that's one thing. What else do men need to hear from their wives? What else might you say?
men need affirmation.
Mm.
Most of our
Okay. That's in my sermon too.
most of our
Yeah.
affirmation comes from within, but there's a whole lot of criticism in there too. There's a whole lot of self-doubt, a whole
Mm.
lot of negativity. I put on a smiling face and act like my podcast is being heard by thousands of listeners, but I'll be ecstatic if 100 people listen to it in the first week.
Yeah.
But I still get on there every day, or not every day, but every week, and I still get on Biblically Speaking every week, and I try to put out a product that is self-fulfilling. And it's not really faking it
Good.
till you make it. It's trying to become what you already know that it can be. But
Mm.
if you're a wife and you are, and I'm not judging you, you're going to have to judge yourself, but you are contributing to his negative self dialogue,
Mm.
he's going to tell you, I know. And honestly, ladies, if you want to fireproof your marriage, you need to know this, because the cute little thing at the office that's wearing the short skirt and the high pumps and is trying to turn his head, and believe me, nothing convinces a woman that she can tempt a man like him wearing a wedding ring.
Mm.
That she is going to be filling his head with all kinds of affirmations. And I said this to Kenny Embry the other day. I keep mentioning Kenny, but Kenny's such a great guy. That there are two kinds of couples that I've talked with who are in the middle of divorce. One is the couple that we think of, we fought all the time, we never saw eye to eye. The other is, we never fought, I didn't know what was going on. And the answer that I give to both of them is, if you want to fix this, you have to stop being selfish. If you don't know what's going on in your man's life, or if you don't know what's going on in your wife's life, you haven't asked. You don't get to write the narrative for two people. You have got to be affirming what he's doing, but you also have to know what he's struggling with.
Yeah, that's good. What do women need to hear from their husbands?
And it's more like what they don't need to hear, and that's criticism. That women have a lot of negative self-talk too, but it's a lot of times about the things that we don't worry so much about. Like, I don't, and I'm not saying these are vain, but I don't really worry about when our family doesn't look as put together as maybe they should. If Will goes out in a pair of jogging pants that are red and a brown t-shirt with blue shoes, I don't care. We're going to the mall. Lauren does. Because women judge women in a way that men don't judge men. Yeah. And men need to understand that there are things that are important to your wife that you won't understand. But they better become important to you, because they are going to hinder her walk with God. And we need to treat them like they're spiritually equal. That, one of the things that is so frustrating to me is when I hear about a group of women getting together for a Bible study, and somebody will ask them what they're studying, or they will suggest, oh, here's a book on women of the Bible. You know how many books have been written on women of the Bible? Hundreds, thousands of those workbooks, and they're the same 8 to 20 women. But what we don't do is we don't encourage our young ladies to sit down and study the Bible as a book. Women's studies can be based on books of the Bible, entire books, and not Ruth and Esther. I mean, they can go study Genesis together, or Colossians, or Ephesians, or the minor prophets. And it doesn't have to all be geared toward being a subservient wife. It's about drawing closer to God. And we need to encourage them in that. We need to encourage them in their attempts to do that. And they don't need any kind of discouragement, because the world will do a better job of that than we ever will. that Kenny was talking about this the other day. He says men report talk and women report talk. That men, you can talk a little trash, you can claim how good you are if you can back it up, and nobody will throw you down. And you can also claim how good you are if you're terrible, and everybody knows you're terrible because everybody understands that you're just having fun at your own expense. And that's how we bond. A lot of times women don't get to do that. If a woman rises above the station that the other women around her perceive her to be in, a lot of times what will happen is they will pull her down. And they'll be gossip and they'll be backbiting. And so an attempt to better herself is going to be met with maybe some gossip, maybe some backbiting by everybody but those who are closest to her. Attempt to lose some weight and get in shape is going to be met with maybe replies like, well, finally, it's about time. Oh, she's going to fail again. Rather than encouragement. Be her encouragement. The other thing I would tell them is live the Song of Solomon, but don't quote the Song of Solomon. Don't tell your wife that her teeth look like goats.
I like that. Live the Song of Solomon, but don't quote the Song of Solomon. Well, Jared, this has been fantastic. I know you and I could talk for hours. We've done it plenty of times. I want to give you the last thought for today's show. What do you want to leave people here with? Actually, before you answer that question, where can people find you on social media? Where can people find you and your podcast?
Well, I have a blog. It's currently unattended for new articles. I need to get some new articles up on there. But I've had so many other irons in the fire. I'm working on a book to get people on the Man Up mailing list. It'll also be sold, but I'm writing a book called Man Up: Spiritual Lessons That We All Need. But you can find me at jaredbollman.blog. I'm on YouTube, Biblically Speaking and Man Up, or Biblically Speaking's on YouTube. And I'm really bad at naming things, Ben, so there's a lot of other Biblically Speakings. Mine's the one with the green diamond that the corners are cut off. And I'm usually making some kind of dorky face in the picture for the thumbnail. You can find Man Up and Biblically Speaking both on Facebook. Man Up it says 1 Corinthians 16:13 with a couple of orange chevrons behind it and Man Up above that. The podcasts are available on Anchor and Apple, Google Play, and most other podcast platforms by now that it's kind of proliferated. To really Google it and search for it, because again, I'm terrible at naming things and there's lots of Man Ups and some of them aren't very good. I mean, the quality is good. The content is probably not something Christians need to be listening to. I'm sure the studio's great, but but put my name at the end of it and it'll come up. It's Man Up, 2 words, ! And then my name, Jared Bollman, and it will pop up.
Okay. Final thought for the audience.
Final thought. You have to know what your spiritual potential is. Nobody can tell you what you can become, but what you become spiritually is completely dependent upon the relationship you build with God. And what your children become, in a lot of ways, is going to be based on the relationship you build with God. And what your wife or your husband becomes is going to be based on the relationship you build with God. So make that the focus. Deepen that relationship. Don't give in to the negative self-talk and the discouragement. Just focus on, how do I take the baby step today that brings me closer to what I ought to be? Because I know that God will meet me with grace and mercy. And if you're a guy, man up.
Perfect way to end. Jarrett, I love you, brother.
You too, buddy.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Anytime.
Keep up the great work. And we'll be talking to everyone who listened. Thank you for your support. And I'll see you later. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, Ben. I enjoyed it.
All right. Take care.